On the last Thursday in September, Margaret Doyle stood on the steps of the Cedar Hollow Mercantile with a single carpetbag at her feet and a boy's hand fisted tight in the folds of her skirt, and the town looked at her the way a town looks at a debt it has decided not to pay. She was 27 years old. She kept her back straight because she had decided, somewhere on the long road in, that she would not let them see her bend. The war had taken her husband 2 winters past, and the fever that followed had taken the farm and the furniture and the small good life they had built. And now it had brought her here, to a dry rail town where everyone knew her story before they knew her name. By supper time, half of them would be telling it. She did not know yet that the man who would change everything was already there, leaning in the shade of the awning across the street, not looking at her the way the others looked. She only knew the weight of the bag and the heat coming off the boards and the small warm pressure of her son's hand. People pitied her. She could feel it land on her shoulders like dust. She had stopped expecting anything else. The boy was Thomas, and he was 7 years old, and he had not spoken a single word since the morning they carried his father home under a wagon sheet. He had simply gone quiet, the way a clock goes quiet when no one winds it. The doctors in the last town had called it a nervous condition and charged her for the saying of it. The women here called it other things, softer in the mouth and crueler in the meaning, the kind of thing said behind a gloved hand on a church bench. Thomas carried his father's harmonica everywhere, a small brass mouth organ worn smooth at the edges and dented along one side, and he kept it in his closed fist or pressed flat against his chest, and no one had heard him play it, and no one had heard him try. He wore a brown wool coat too big at the wrists, his mother's careful mending along the seam, and he watched the world with the steady, sealed-up patience of a child who has learned that grown people's promises do not always keep. When the merchant's wife crouched down to coo at him with practiced sweetness, he only looked at her, and the looking unsettled her more than any answer could have. Margaret set her hand on his shoulder. She did not explain him. She had learned that explaining only fed them. She asked the clerk after honest work and a clean room, and the clerk found his ledger very interesting, and behind her the bell over the door rang as the whispering began, and she stood in it the way you stand in cold water, waiting for the part of you that flinches to give up and go still. Across the street, Eli Brandt had watched the whole of it from under the awning, and he had said nothing, because saying things in front of a crowd had never been his way. He was 35, broad through the shoulders from 20 years of his own ground, with sun-browned forearms and a careful, weathered face and hands that bore the flat shine of old work. He farmed alone 3 miles east, where the road gave out at a creek and a stand of cottonwoods, and he had farmed alone long enough that the town had stopped trying to marry him off and started calling him solitary, which was the kindest of the words they used. He had buried people too, though he did not speak of it, and grief had taught him to notice the things other men hurried past. He noticed how the woman on the steps did not beg. He noticed that the boy's coat had been mended by someone who could not afford new thread, but refused to send him out looking poor. He noticed the merchant's wife smiling the smile she kept for the unfortunate, and he noticed the clerk's ledger, and he noticed that not one of the men who knew him well enough to nod had crossed the street. So he crossed it. He did not make a speech of it. He picked up the carpetbag before she could refuse, set it in the bed of his buckboard, and said plainly that he had more work than one man could keep up with and a spare room going to waste, and that if she wanted honest pay for honest keeping, he could offer it, and that it would only be temporary until she found her feet. He said the word temporary the way men say a thing they do not quite believe. Margaret looked at him a long moment. Nobody hurried her. Then she lifted the boy into the wagon and climbed up after him, and the town stored the whole picture away for later. The farmhouse was plain and well kept, a low frame house with a deep porch and a barn that smelled of hay and harness and a creek you could hear at night through an open window. Eli gave them the upstairs room with the slanted ceiling and the iron bedstead, and he put fresh ticking in the mattress without being asked, and he carried up a coal oil lamp and trimmed the wick and showed her where the matches were kept dry. He took his own bed in the small room off the kitchen and made no further mention of it. The arrangement was built on plain ground, the kind that holds. He would not call it charity because charity would have shamed her, and he understood that her dignity was the one thing the road had not taken. So he made it work. He needed the eggs gathered and the garden kept and the bread baked and the wash done and the books squared, and she needed a roof and a wage and a place where her boy could be quiet without being a spectacle, and they were honest about the trade and careful with each other. And for the first time in 2 winters, Margaret slept a whole night through. In the morning, she found that he had already drawn the water and split the kindling and gone out to the far field before light, and on the kitchen table, beside the cold stove, he had left the coffee tin pulled forward where she would see it, and a clean cup set out, and nothing said. She stood there a while with her hand on the cup. Then she lit the fire and got to work, and she did not thank him because she understood that thanking him would have made it into something it was not. Thomas did not trust the farm, and the farm did not rush him. The boy kept to the edges of rooms and the corners of the yard, the harmonica in his fist, watching the man with the sealed-up wariness of a child, waiting to be disappointed. Eli did not coax him. He did not crouch down and ask him questions in the bright false voice grown people use on the grieving young. He simply made room. When he mended the loose board on the bottom porch step, the one that had caught Margaret's heel her first evening, he did it without announcement. And the boy watched from the doorway, and neither of them spoke of the step again, though the boy tested it with his foot the next morning and found it solid. When Eli went to the barn to feed the bay mare, he left the stall door open the right amount and went about his work, and after 3 mornings the boy was standing at the rail, and after 5 he was holding out a flat palm of oats. The mare took them gently. Eli did not look over. He had decided that the boy would come the rest of the way on his own legs or not at all, and that pushing would only teach him to brace. So he set out small kindnesses the way another man might set out traps, except his were meant to free a thing rather than catch it. A cup of milk left at the boy's place, a whittled top, finished and set on the windowsill without a word. The barn cat carried in from the cold and deposited, purring, in the boy's lap. Margaret saw all of it and said nothing, because she understood now that this was how the man spoke, and that he was, in his plain and roundabout way, speaking to her son in the only language her son still trusted, which was the language of things done and not said. It was the boy who tested the firmness, the way the guarded ones always do, to learn whether the steadiness was real or just another promise waiting to break. On a gray afternoon near the end of the 2nd week, Thomas left the gate to the kitchen garden unlatched, and the mare got in among the late cabbages and the bean rows and trampled a season's careful work into the mud before Margaret could chase her out. Margaret's face went white because she knew what ruined food meant going into winter, and she knew worse what it might cost a boy to be the cause of it under a roof that was not his own. Thomas stood at the edge of the wreck, with his fist white around the harmonica, braced, waiting for the shout he had decided was coming, because in his short, hard experience the shout always came. Eli walked the rows once, slow, looking at the damage. Then he crouched down to the boy's height, which he had never done before, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not soften it into pity either. He said that gates were a thing a man learned by forgetting them once, and that the cabbages would come again in spring, and that he would be glad of the help replanting what could be saved, if the boy was willing. That was all. He stood and went for the spade, and something in the boy's braced shoulders let go, a small, giving way, the kind you would miss if you were not watching for it. And that evening Thomas latched the gate himself, twice, and stood looking at the latch a long while in the failing light, as though he had learned that some doors Once you shut them right, stay shut. Margaret watched from the window with her hands gone still in the dishwater, and she did not let herself cry, because she had decided long ago that crying was a thing she did alone or not at all. The frost came early that year, and with it the suppers grew warmer and the evenings longer, and the three of them settled into a rhythm that no one called anything, because naming it would have made it fragile. They put up the harvest together against the coming cold, the three of them at it from first light. Margaret strung apples to dry along the kitchen rafters, and set the sorghum to boil down sweet and dark, and she packed the carrots and turnips in damp sand in the root cellar the way her own mother had taught her, layer on layer against the months when nothing grew. Eli smoked the hams in the little log smokehouse out back, and banked the woodpile high along the north wall, and stuffed rag and clay into the cracks where the wind came through. And Thomas carried kindling and shelled corn, and held the lantern steady in the blue cold of the early dark without being asked. They ate at the same table. Eli taught the boy to set a fence post true, and to read the weather in the way the cottonwoods turn their leaves to know snow by the smell of the iron sky before it came. Margaret's bread filled the house with a smell that made the place feel lived in for the first time in years, and her ledgers brought the farm's tangled accounts into clean columns, and Eli found to his quiet surprise that he had begun listening for the sound of the kitchen door and the boy's feet on the stairs. One evening, with the lamp low and a cold rain ticking the glass, Thomas fell asleep against Eli's arm by the stove, the harmonica loose in his open hand for the first time since the wagon sheet, and Eli sat very still so as not to wake him, and Margaret looked across the room at the two of them and felt something she had thought the war had burned out of her come quietly back to life. Nobody said the word for it. But it was the boy, days later, who said the truest thing, the way the unguarded always do. He could not say it in speech, not yet. But on a morning when Eli was leaving for town and pulled on his coat, Thomas crossed the kitchen and took the man's rough hand in both of his small ones and would not let go. And when Eli looked down, the boy mouthed, silent and clear, the shape of a word that needed no sound to be heard, and the word was stay. Eli stayed. He hung his coat back on the peg and went out to the barn instead, and let the town wait, and Margaret turned to the stove so neither of them would see her face. But warmth in a small town draws the cold the way an open door draws a draught. Hattie Cruz, the merchant's wife, arrived on a clear, bright morning with a basket of preserves and a voice full of practiced concern, and she sat in Eli Brandt's kitchen and said, in the warm, careful tone women use to deliver a knife, that people were beginning to talk, that a widow and an unwed man under one roof was a hard thing for a Christian town to overlook, that she said it only out of fondness, only out of worry for the boy. Margaret poured the coffee with steady hands and did not defend herself, because she had learned that defending only confirmed the charge in their eyes, and Hattie was not the worst of it. Behind her came Royce Vandermeer, the land agent, smooth and well-fed, who had heard there was a widow with a soldier's claim to her name, and a useless silent boy, and no man to speak for them, and who came calling with his hat in his hand and an offer dressed up as rescue. He spoke to Margaret as though the matter were settled. He would marry her and give the boy a name, and the town would call it decent, and in return there was the small matter of the pension paperwork and a quarter section the late husband's service had entitled the child to, which a husband could of course manage on the boy's behalf. He smiled the whole time he said it. Margaret felt the old cold rise, the certainty that she was a thing to be claimed rather than a person to be known, and she saw behind the man's smile the appetite that wore concern like a borrowed coat. She told him no plainly. He told her, just as plainly and still smiling, that a woman in her position did not have the luxury of no, and that the town would side with the man offering marriage over the man offering a spare room, and he let that sit. He let her see, too, the quiet machinery behind the smile, the way he mentioned that the county clerk was a particular friend of his, and that paperwork concerning a fatherless boy could go easy or go hard, depending on who spoke for the child, and that a hired woman with no standing made a poor guardian in the eyes of the law. Then he tipped his hat and said he would call again when she had thought it through, and the warmth pulled back out of the days that followed the way water pulls back from a shore before a hard frost. And Margaret lay awake doing sums that never came out right and did not tell Eli, because telling him would have asked something of him she had sworn never to ask of any man again. The reckoning came at the autumn social in the church hall, where the whole town gathered under the lamps with their cider and their gossip, and Royce Vandermeer chose his ground well in front of all of them, because a man like that knows a thing is only true once a crowd has watched it. He stood up where everyone could hear and spoke of his Christian offer and the widow's stubbornness, and he turned the silent boy into his proof, saying loud and sorrowful that the child was plainly damaged, that he needed a proper father and a firm hand, that a woman alone clinging to a hired room was no fit place to raise a boy who could not even speak, and he looked to Hattie Cruz and the other women for the murmur of agreement, and he got it, and the whole hall went still, and storing it up the way crowds do. Margaret stood with her hand on Thomas's shoulder and felt the boy go rigid, and she opened her mouth to defend him and found, as she always found, that words were the one weapon the world had never let her keep. Everything seemed to slow. The cold air at the open door held everything in place. And into that stillness Eli Brandt set down his cup and crossed the floor, unhurried, every eye on him, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not make a speech, because that was never his way. He stopped in front of Vandermeer, and then he turned his back on him, which in front of a whole town said more than shouting could. He went down on one knee in front of the boy. He held out his open, work-worn hand, and he said, plain as fence posts, that he had room at his table for as long as the boy and his mother would honor it, that he was asking for keeps and not for temporary, and that he would be proud past saying to give the boy his name if the boy and his mother would have it, and that nobody, then or ever, would call this child damaged in his hearing again. The hall held its breath, and Thomas Doyle looked up at the kneeling man, and then he lifted his father's harmonica, the brass one worn smooth and dented along one side, the one he had guarded in his fist through 2 hard winters and never once let touch his lips, and he raised it slow, and he set it to his mouth, and in front of the whole staring town he played. It was a thin, broken, wavering little tune, the kind a father teaches a small boy on a porch in summer, and it cracked and steadied and went on, and it was the most any of them had heard out of that child in 2 years, and it filled the church hall like the first water after a long drought. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth. Eli stayed on his knee with his eyes bright and his jaw set, and let the boy finish. And when the last note thinned out into the rafters, Thomas lowered the harmonica, and he looked at the man kneeling in front of him, and in a small, rusted voice that had not been used in 2 years, scraped and uncertain and entirely his own, he said one word, and the word was yes. Some things change the moment you look at them straight. Hattie Cruz found her preserves very interesting. Royce Vandermeer took his hat and left, and the town that had pitied a widow on the mercantile steps revised its verdict by the time the cider was gone, the way towns do once the deciding has been done for them. Margaret crossed the floor and put her hand in Eli's, and nobody hurried her, and she had nothing left in her to say no with, and she did not want to. They were married before the first hard snow, plainly, in the same church hall, with the boy standing up beside them, holding the harmonica where his father might have stood. By the second spring, the trampled garden came back thick and green, and the farm that the town had once mentioned in the same breath as the cursed and the unfortunate was spoken of, when it was spoken of at all, as the Brandt place, where the bread was good and the boy could be heard from the road. Thomas talked now, not a flood of it, but enough, plain and unhurried, like the men he had learned it from, and on warm evenings he sat on the deep porch with his father's harmonica and played the thin little tune until it came out whole, while Eli mended harness and Margaret shelled peas into her lap, and the creek ran on under the cottonwoods the way it always had. The harmonica that had once lived sealed in a grieving fist now lived on the windowsill in the sun where any hand could reach it, which is its own kind of healing, the kind that does not announce itself. And if you had driven that road at dusk, you would have seen only a plain farmhouse with a lamp in the window and 3 people on a porch and a boy's small music carrying out over the fields. And you would never have guessed how far any of them had come to be that quiet, or how much it costs to stand at last on ground that finally holds, because the ones who are truly known are not the ones who were rescued, but the ones somebody chose to make room for. That was tonight's story from the Hearth and Homestead, the war widow, her silent boy, and the reserved farmer who made room. So tell me in the comments, did the boy come back to himself because a man finally stayed, or because a mother never once let him go? And thank you for sitting up with the lamp a while longer tonight.